Welcome to Central Speaks, home of our weekly podcast. Central Speaks is produced by Hamilton Central Baptist Church.
A doctor, an engineer, and a politician were arguing as to which profession was older and more significant. Well, argued the doctor, without a physician, humankind could not have survived, so I'm sure that mine is the oldest profession. No, said the engineer, before life began there was complete chaos, and it took an engineer to create some semblance of order from this chaos, so engineering is the older. But, chirped the triumphant politician, who created the chaos? Politicians and politics are obviously looming large in our consciousness as our nation engages in a general election to determine who's going to govern us for the next 3 years. The billboards are up, the leaflets are invading our letterboxes, and politicians from a range of ideologies, they're all vying for media airtime. Well, this time around, in addition to voting for parties and electorate candidates, there's also two important referenda that we get a say in as well. It would seem appropriate, therefore, that we think a little bit about our response to this from a Christian or a kingdom perspective. I mean, how does the Bible inform us in how to participate in something like a general election? Indeed, maybe before we consider which way we'll cast our vote, we need to consider why we should even bother ourselves with an issue like government in the first place. I mean, after all, doesn't the Bible suggest that we're like aliens and exiles in this world and that our real home is actually with God in heaven? So what advice does the Bible offer on how we relate toward those who govern us? Well, actually, the New Testament is far from silent on this subject. At least 4 different New Testament authors record instructions on how Christ followers are supposed to relate to the state that they're in. Now, we may not always agree with the policies or the values that a particular government has, and we may even find ourselves needing to speak out against what's been proposed or done. But the Bible does speak to us about how followers of Jesus relate toward those who govern us. Take, for instance, these words from the Apostle Paul to the Christians in the city of Rome. Romans chapter 13, verse 1. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you'll be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid. For rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it's necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. This is also why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give to everyone what you owe. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. Well, then there's these words from the Apostle Peter in 1 Peter chapter 2. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of the foolish. So in light of a looming election, let me highlight a number of principles about our attitude and our behavior towards those who govern over us. And firstly, governing authorities are to be respected as servants of God. Paul said there's no authority except that which God has established, and the authority that exists have been established by God. Well, or maybe a statement like this actually raises challenges for us. I mean, what about those in governmental authority who do or stand for things that are obviously in conflict with God's revealed will? I mean, how do we show respect for those who stand for values that conflict with our understanding of the will of God? Can we really see them as God's servants when we know that they're wrong? Well, I suspect this idea didn't sit any more comfortably with the Christians of Paul's time than it might with us today. The Roman government of Paul's day, and certainly for several centuries onwards, was not exactly renowned for its human rights record or its tolerance of those who disagreed with government policy. Yet Paul clearly refers to them as an authority set in place by God, God's servants, and to be respected as such. So what did Paul really mean by that? Well, at the very least, Paul was suggesting that the idea of government or civic authority over a nation or a community is an institution of God. It's an idea God specifically sanctions, and I guess perhaps in a similar way that we talk about marriage being an institution ordained and established by God too. Without laws or regulations that govern our conduct, the world would be in chaos. Without it, there would be no restraint on property theft or violence or immoral behavior or abuse of power. Or to put this another way, the God of the Bible is not a God of chaos, but of order. So therefore, systems that define, that regulate and enforce acceptable behavior, that is a God-ordained institution. It's not something evil or humanistic that has merely evolved over the centuries to which we as Christ followers have freedom or exemption from following. But both the apostles Paul and Peter seem to go a step further in actually suggesting that every governing authority is actually established by God. Well, when you think about that's actually a pretty big call. What about governments that are corrupt or unjust? What about governments that persecute dissidents or propagate atheism? What about apartheid or fundamentalist Islamic or fundamentalistic Hindu governments? What about governments that promulgate moral values that flagrantly conflict with God's values as it's revealed in the Bible? I mean, was Paul suggesting that God has set in place those kinds of governments too? Well, to be honest, I mean, answers to these kinds of questions are quite complex. I'm not sure that my response will do justice to all that Paul had in mind here. Suffice it to say that unjust government was very much a feature of Paul and Peter's day, both of whom were executed for having a faith that was deemed by the civic authorities to be illegal. Now, when Paul and Peter talked about the idea of God establishing the concept of government, that surely doesn't imply that God agrees or is complicit with every policy a government adopts. And yet in his permissive will, God has allowed that authority to rise and to assume power. Now, I don't for a moment believe that God approves of all the policies and edicts of governors like Joseph Stalin or Adolf Hitler or Pol Pot or some of the other despotic leaders in our current era. Nor by the same token does God always support the policies of democracies with which we're more familiar. Yet, in his permissive will, the Bible says that God allows these kinds of governments to assume power. So why is that the case? Well, we may not fully understand it, but then we also accept that our perspective on affairs of this world are somewhat flat and one-dimensional compared to the dimensions of wisdom that God possesses. Maybe it's like how God allowed the nation of Israel to appoint a king in Saul, son of Kish, when he had stated that it really was his will that he be their ruler and sovereign. Maybe God at certain times and seasons actually gives us over to the desires of our hearts and allows us the consequences of the types of governments that we deserve. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul speaks of how the Spirit of God holds back the force of lawlessness in our world, how a time is coming when that restraint will be lifted. So while we might recoil in horror at the atrocities and anarchy that some governments permit and encourage in our day and age, we also do need to keep in mind how much worse our world could be when God removes his restraint. So we may not fully understand how all this works, but we can be very grateful for the fact that the devil or Satan is actually on a leash. Now, the important point is this. Regardless of our party political preference, or regardless of how much we like or dislike the policies of a particular government, the Christian worldview is such that we accept a government is in power because God, maybe for reasons best known only to him, has allowed that to be. May not be the one we chose or prefer, or the one we voted for. It may not even be one that always conducts itself with righteousness and justice. However, it is a government that God has allowed to rule and therefore to be respected. A second point we need to note: we obey the laws of the land. Now, followers of Jesus live within the law, not outside of it. Here's what Paul wrote to a young pastor called Titus. In Titus chapter 3, verse 1, he said, "Remind the people to be subject to rulers and authorities, to be obedient and ready to do whatever is good." The Apostle Peter said this, "For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of the foolish." So when Paul and Peter wrote these words, they were living at a time when there were some outlandish accusations that were being made about Christians in the local community. For instance, the language used in the church to describe something like the communion service was being misconstrued in the equivalent to social media of the day as a form of cannibalism. They ate the body and they drank the blood of their leader. Or language around love for one another within the family of God. That was being twisted in local gossip as a form of incest. In its earliest days, Christianity was regarded as a sect of Judaism, and while among the ruling authorities, the Jews had a reputation for having a bit of an attitude, and they were being rebels and insurrectionists. So therefore, the advice was, keep your head down as a Christian and to change the popular view by being law-abiding. But this wasn't just a self-protection strategy. In Romans chapter 13, verse 2, Paul actually lifts the idea of obedience to governing authorities to the level of a spiritual discipline. He said, "Whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves." In other words, breaking the laws of our land, well, not only invokes the wrath of the government or the law enforcers, it actually also gets us offside with God. To break the laws of the land is to sin. Now, you might want to react at that by citing times when the laws of the land stand in direct conflict with the values of God. I mean, are we to just blindly obey the law if it tells us to renounce our faith? A situation the earliest Christians were actually faced with, forced to say, Caesar is Lord. Or if the law promulgates a flagrant injustice or harm towards the defenseless. Remember in Daniel chapter 3, the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, passed a stupid law requiring every citizen to bow down to a golden statue. And those three brave young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, rightly refused. They practiced civil disobedience to the laws of the land. Maybe a contemporary comparison in our day and age might be something like an outlandish law that said that abortion of all third pregnancies in a family is now compulsory. Or maybe anyone over the age of 70 who becomes ill must be euthanized. Or whoever is elected as Prime Minister can never be disagreed with. Now, there definitely is a place for civil disobedience in those situations where the laws of a land conflict with the laws of God. But the meaning of civil disobedience also means we take the consequences. And those 3 young men who defied King Nebuchadnezzar, well, they were thrown into the furnace for their stand. But those, situations, they're kind of exceptions to the general rule, right? Followers of Jesus honor and obey the law, and that includes our attitude towards those who enforce the law. Listen again to how Paul expressed this in Romans 13, this time from the Living Bible. For the policeman does not frighten people who are doing right, but those doing evil will always fear him. So if you don't want to be afraid, keep the laws and you will get along well. The policeman is sent by God to help you, but if you are doing something wrong, of course you should be afraid, for he will have you punished. He is sent by God for that purpose. So the concept, the function of law enforcement, that is God ordained as well. That they are servants of the Lord and they deserve our encouragement and support and our prayers. Then a third thing that we could note would be that we should be willing contributors to government. Now, to put that more starkly, the Christian attitude to government is one that willingly pays tax. It's the moral responsibility to pay our due. Don't take my word for it. Here's what Paul said again in Romans 13. This is why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give to everyone what you owe. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. Now, I suspect I'm not likely to win too many friends for reminding us about this. Was it Thomas Jefferson who first made that statement, there are 2 certainties in life, death and taxes? Now, by all means, we have a divine right to scrutinize and challenge the right use of government tax revenue. And, political parties all around the world campaign on the platform of keeping tax as low as it can be. I mean, none of us enjoy parting with money we've earned. And yet there is a kingdom value that actually challenges the dominant attitude of the world. Paying tax is also a Christian responsibility. Remember that little trap that the religious leaders tried to set for Jesus with regard to taxes in Matthew 22? Tell us then, what's your opinion? Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? But Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, You hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin used for paying tax. And they brought him a denarius. And he asked them, Whose image is this? And whose inscription? Caesar's, they replied. Then he said to them, Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. We are to render to Caesar, or the governing authority, what is rightfully theirs. In other words, the act of governing and administration of a society, that costs money. It costs money to upkeep roads and to run schools and to protect the innocent from the lawless and dishonest acts of those who would take unfair advantage. It costs money to dispose of waste and sewage and provide power and drainage to our homes. If we're recipients of these benefits, as we all are, then we have a moral responsibility to render to Caesar what is needful in order to fund it. And the Bible actually takes a dim view of those who dodge paying their way when it comes to taxation. Those who lie and cheat and use all manner of creative loopholes to avoid paying their fair share, that they're actually not only stealing from the government, they're actually stealing from us all. This is not a charge to be leveled at followers of Jesus. Then a fourth thing we could note is that we are to be diligent intercessors. 1 Timothy chapter 2. I urge then, first of all, that petitions, prayers, and intercession and thanksgiving be made for everyone, for kings and all those in authorities, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. This is good and pleases God our Saviour. So those in positions of civic leadership, both those who devise laws and those who enforce them, well, they are to be often and repeatedly the focus of our prayers. I'm yet to meet anyone who believes they do this enough. Maybe that's why we get the kinds of governments that we do. Now, leadership in any sphere can be lonely and a thankless task. We might like to criticize those who govern us, but, well, how many of us would like the weight of the responsibilities that they carry? Now, as servants of God's order in the world, civic leaders need the undergirding of our prayers that they will govern rightly, that they will seek wise counsel, that they will lead with a sense of holy fear of the Lord. It was the British parliamentarian and historian Lord Acton who wrote in a letter to Bishop Mandell Crichton back in 1887 those famous words, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Great men are almost always bad men." So we need to pray for our leaders that they will have a sane and a humble appreciation of who they are and what they are capable of achieving. And then lastly, a fifth thing that we could note is that we should be willing to participate in the process of government. Now, I don't have a text to quote on this final point, but, well, there are numerous examples throughout the Bible. Charles de Gaulle, for instance, the former French president, once said, "Politics is far too important a matter to leave in the hands of politicians." In other words, each sector of a society has both a right and a responsibility to involve itself in the formation of laws and policies that govern a nation. Now, some people have misunderstood the concept of separation of church and state to mean that, well, politics is kind of dirty business that we Christians should stay away from. But that's not what it means at all. I mean, the background behind the idea of separation of church and state was actually the history of corrupt kingdoms and principalities across the continent of Europe, where it was difficult to distinguish governmental leadership from church leadership. This is going back several hundred years now. And kings and princes would meddle and impose their will on the affairs of the church, and church leaders would impose their convictions and opinions on those who governed, and both legitimized the other. I remember a few years back, a former Prime Minister of New Zealand made the rather unfortunate comment. He said that the church should keep out of politics, and then politicians will keep out of the church. You know, I couldn't disagree more. We need more politicians attending church, not less. But I would want to make a case for followers of Jesus pursuing careers in government, not shying away from it. It can be a very important calling from God. Now, Jesus had no hesitation in speaking into the local government of his day concerning their hypocrisy and corruption. Remember John the Baptist, he was actually beheaded because he dared to do something similar. Old Testament heroes like Joseph and Daniel were career politicians who became the equivalent of prime ministers of their respective countries. They exerted a godly influence over the affairs of state. Prophets like Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Elijah consistently preached the word of the Lord to those who ruled and reigned over them. Now, government or politics is not a dirty word in the Christian vocabulary. Joining a political party and becoming active in party politics is not necessarily a carnal thing to do. Jesus said that we are the light of the world and the salt of the earth, and these are just the kinds of places where we need more light and godly influence. Now, the concept of government is a God-ordained institution. It's worthy of our respect, our submission, our financial support, and our prayers. It's also worthy of our participation. It may not always go the way we think it should, but it is something we have a moral right and a responsibility to participate with. So, next Saturday, or earlier if you so choose, exercise your opportunity to have your say. Pray, ask the Holy Spirit to guide you, and then cast your vote according to your conscience. But be mindful that not everyone will vote or believe the same way you do. But we trust in the oversight and the providence of God to work in and through all our systems, and we accept that those who govern over us will be the ones that God has allowed so to do.
Thanks for joining us this week online. Come join us on Sunday mornings too if you're in Hamilton. Find out more about Hamilton Central Baptist Church and discover ways to get involved at www.hcbc.nz. Join us again next week at Central Speaks.